I'm Mark Lippman. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to the Arts and Sciences Distinguished Lecture Series. As a major urban university, part of our mission is to provide educational opportunities for the community, and as part of that outreach effort, we've been having this lecture series since 1982. You can see the former lectures in your program. Twice a year, the School of Arts and Sciences gathers to hear distinguished scholars speak on a topic of broad interest, sometimes topical, sometimes one of those questions that human beings have been asking almost forever. We ask our speakers for a bit of their expertise to profess from the core of their learning. In the fall, we bring in a distinguished speaker from outside. In the spring, we take advantage of and celebrate the accomplishments of one of our own. And the goal, of course, very simple. It's just the spread of knowledge and the enjoyment that we get from a glimpse into the mind of an expert. And tonight, the host is the Department of Anthropology, and I'd like to ask the chair, Professor Alan Sandstrom, to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you.
Do your thing.
Well, good evening. I'll try to talk loud so everybody can hear. We don't have a microphone for me. They have one for Larry, though. It's a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Lawrence A. Kusnar, who is a professor in the Department of Anthropology, to offer the College of Arts and Sciences 2005 Distinguished Lecture. These last couple of phrases I mentioned are significant for those of you who have been around here for a while. This is now the College of Arts and Sciences instead of the school. I remember when it was Arts and Letters a long time ago. And it's now the Department of Anthropology rather than the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Since, thanks to our dean, we've now had an amicable divorce and we've become a separate department. Larry received his bachelor's degree from Pennsylvania State University with honors and distinction. He received his master's in anthropology from Northwestern University in anthropology, a Master of Science from Northwestern University in mathematical methods, and a PhD from Northwestern University in anthropology. He came to IPFW as a visiting assistant professor in 1990, was put on the tenure track in 1991, and became a full professor in 2001. He has 3 areas of expertise in anthropology, which is extremely rare. There's only 4 subfields, and mastering one of them is almost impossible. He's a master of 3 of them: cultural anthropology, archaeology, and bioanthropology. His field research, and this is very important for anthropologists, the first thing they'll talk about is their field work, has been all over the place. He's done archaeology in the United States and Peru. He's done ethnoarchaeology among the Aymara peoples of Peru and Argentina. These are herding people. He's done recently work among Navajo in Arizona. His current research is a little mystifying to me. It's little dots on computer screens. And he's doing simulation research, and I'm not sure what that's all about. Maybe someday we'll have a lecture and he can tell us about it. He's extremely well published and well known for somebody as young as he is. He's written 3 books already. His, I think, most well known is a 1997 book called Reclaiming a Scientific Anthropology, which catapulted him into national and international renown. He's also got more than 35 articles in the most prestigious international and national journals in anthropology. He has also, behind the scenes, while he's doing all this, energetically contributed to the success of the Department of Anthropology at IPFW. His talk this evening, which I think is up there, is Poverty is Not Enough: The Role of Wealth Distributions, the role wealth distributions play in ethnic conflict, rebellion, and warfare. Please welcome Larry Kusnar.
Can everyone hear me okay? Mic's on? Good. Well, thank you so much for those very kind words from both Dean Lippman and Alan in my department. And just glancing over the former speakers here, I am genuinely honored to be here tonight, to have been selected by the Arts and Sciences Committee. We've got a lot of really great stars at IPFW, and being counted to be worthy among some of those numbers is really quite an honor. And by the way of introductions and acknowledgments, I'd also like to point out that while I've been asked very nicely to come here and deliver this lecture tonight, what I'm going to be talking about is research that I've done that has been inherently collaborative. And before I go any further, I want to recognize my two co-conspirators, Bill Frederick from the Department of Mathematics, who's been instrumental in all of this, and Bob Settlemeyer, if he's here, from the Department of Computer Sciences. And we've been bringing together our various expertise in a rather synergistic activity that's led to much of what you're going to see tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge industry partner that we have in Fort Wayne. We've been really trying to reach out to the community and in a mutual way help one another out, university and industry locally. And the Fort Wayne division of Northrop Grumman has been very supportive, initially in challenging us to make our research relevant and intelligible to the real world, which really helped catapult our research along even further. And also recently with some very generous financial assistance. So I want to acknowledge that as well. Okay. Well, poverty is not enough. The role wealth distributions play in ethnic conflict, rebellions, and warfare. What I want to look at tonight is how wealth distributions might be fueling what we variously call collective unrest, insurgencies, rebellions, etc. We use a lot of different terms for these things, but always the situation is an asymmetric situation where there's some group who feels aggrieved by some larger entity, usually a nation state, and then they seek ways of rebelling against that. Well, of course, there's a lot of, the technology's rebelling. Here we go. Okay. There's a lot of ink that's been spilled on this over the years, but there's several paradoxes that have really troubled researchers. And one of those is, why do people who have it good, or from our perspective have it good, why do they rebel? And so the central paradox really is, why do the wealthy rebel? It kind of makes sense. If you're really, really poor, you might be very upset, aggrieved, and want to rebel. But what's going on with the wealthy? Historians have documented that most rebellions don't actually occur in situations of abject, destitute poverty, but rather after periods of economic growth. That's a tip-off that wealth is involved somehow in this process, but perhaps not the way that we've been thinking. Also, despite populist characterizations, rebellions usually involve only the minority of a population. Despite the popular depictions like Les Miserables or Dr. Zhivago, or these mass rebellions of the poor and destitute, in point of fact, very few people ever actually take up arms and try to rebel. And very often, the leaders, actually not very often, always the leaders tend to be very well-off individuals. So something else is going on here. Also, despite revolutionary rhetoric, the rebellions usually are started and led by people who are particularly well-off. Lenin actually hailed from the nobility of Russian society. Castro was the son of a wealthy planter. And of course, we all know about Osama bin Laden's background. Another thing that's very important for us to bear in mind throughout this evening is that rebellion is inherently costly and risky. It's a high-risk venture. Over 90% of rebellions end within the first few years, and the leaders usually don't survive them. So people that engage in this kind of behavior are taking a very genuine risk when they do so. I might take this moment to plug yet another one of our stars on campus, because his work is very relevant and has actually helped inform the research that we've been doing. It's Dr. James Lutz from political science, and he and his wife Brenda Lutz, who I believe is a graduate student in sociology here, have recently published an excellent book entitled Global Terrorism that I encourage everyone to read. And some of these patterns come out loud and clear in the pages of their book as they do this kind of cross-nation survey of terrorist movements. Well, rebelling is risky. People who don't seem to have an excuse to rebel. Could this mean that wealth doesn't matter at all? And could this be anthropology's final triumph? For those of you that aren't real familiar with anthropology, we invented the culture thing. Okay, that's our thing. We've specialized in studying religions and their influences on people's behavior, ethnic identity, etc., etc. That's all us. We started that whole thing. So if wealth doesn't really matter, could this be anthropology's final triumph? You see this in some popular and very influential books like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. He says it's culture. Culture is fueling conflict in our world today. People have different cultures. They can't communicate across those lines. It creates conflict. It's racism. We hear that an awful lot. We heard it very much in the conflict in Rwanda, where Hutu and Tutsi were at one another. The Balkans would be another really excellent example of that, where you had Serb, Croat, and Bosnians fighting. And of course, a lot of the same examples could be used to illustrate that religion is the culprit. People have different religions. These religions fuel their hatreds and cause these conflicts to occur. Al-Qaeda, of course, being a great example of that, having a jihadist orientation. But of course, we can also look to Northern Ireland, conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. Well, these are all the things that anthropology has really pioneered studying: culture, religion, racism. But as an anthropologist, I'm here to say tonight, not so fast. Okay? Now, I will say, I think it takes an anthropologist to appreciate the special ways, maybe, that wealth is important. But a lot of these other things very often turn out to be more surface phenomena, and there are actually very important underlying competitions over wealth that fuel these other causes that seem apparent to us, but might be more chimera. So wealth matters. One problem with using culture and ethnicity to say that or religion to say that's what causes violence is that these things don't really have any kind of real physical existence in and of themselves. So they therefore, as philosophers would say, and I see my colleague Ken Long from philosophy nodding, they lack causal efficacy. It's very difficult in a scientific fashion to really connect up how a belief leads to a behavior. That turns out to be a really sticky problem. So maybe we need to look for more concrete phenomena as the source of behaviors. Another issue, despite the issue in any revolutionary rhetoric, wealth is always looming, if not in the foreground, always in the background. And we have here a quote from Osama bin Laden's 1996 declaration of war against the Americans and others. It's got a long title. But the important thing is, he says right here, the Crusader forces became the main cause of our disastrous condition, especially in the economical aspect. Wealth keeps rearing its head in these issues time and time again, regardless of what the ostensive agenda might be. And another, I think, very salient point here is that successful insurgencies, and there's not many that turn out to be successful, but successful ones often learn to provide material services to the people they're trying to win over. And two very good examples would be the activities of Hamas and Hezbollah. Hezbollah really is quite striking. During the Lebanese Civil War about, 10, 12 years ago, all was chaos. It was like Mad Max. The Lebanese government obviously had totally collapsed. Syrians came in. You had the Israelis invading from the south. No one was capable of really supplying the basic material needs of people. And so what did Hezbollah do? Instead of preaching, that came later, they loaded up big trucks with water and delivered water with their slogan on the side of the truck. Once the people's basic material needs are met, then they could start working on them for the ideological part. And so all these things indicate that we're probably foolhardy to ignore wealth in any explanation of any sort of collective violence. And so how is it that wealth matters? I'd like to comment on a couple of theories that have been used very much in the field of political science. One of those is relative deprivation theory. And it's simply stated, people lash out when their aspirations are thwarted. All right? And that kind of makes a lot of intuitive sense. There's been a lot of debate over this theory over the years. One problem that researchers have run into is that there tends to be an unreliable correlation between poverty and actual rebellious activity. And that's curious. If the notion is that the deprived feel upset and rebel, but when you actually look at the wealth backgrounds of people, and there's some outstanding research done in Lebanon and among Palestinian populations that looks at this, you find that you don't really get that correlation with poverty. You probably anecdotally, you've noticed this when you hear about, suicide bombers and whatnot. Sometimes you hear about some 17-year-old kid, comes from a poor background, educated in madrasa, he blows himself up. But haven't you all heard about that nursing student also that blew herself up? Here's someone who seemingly had a future. So what's going on here? Is it simply religious indoctrination? Or could there be some other role that wealth is playing that motivates, ironically, even comparatively well-off people to rebel and to lash out? The other theory is resource mobilization. In this theory, it's kind of assumed that people are always willing to lash out, but what determines who does it and who doesn't is whether or not they have the resources to do that. Mounting a rebellion costs money. You don't just do these things. And in some cases, you might have people who feel very aggrieved, but if they don't have the resources to organize, mobilize, purchase explosives, weapons, and whatnot, no rebellion is going to occur. And so that's another approach that political scientists have taken. One of the problems with this is when you look at people who are who do have the resources to rebel, very often a lot of them don't rebel either. Probably we need a combination of these two things. And to be true to the political scientists, recently there have been some important publications where they've kind of synthesized these two approaches. And what it amounts to is really an optimization under constraints. I put optimization in quotes. This doesn't mean that people completely rationally figure out what is absolutely best to do. But what it means, and in the usage I'm using here tonight, is that people are striving for things that they want, to better themselves. But they have to do that with respect to constraints upon them. So you could have someone highly motivated who doesn't have the resources, they're not going to rebel. You have someone who's not motivated, doesn't have the desire to optimize, could have the resources, they're not going to rebel. It's only when we get those two factors together that we would expect to see any kind of collective action in rebellion. And this is where IPFW comes in the collaboration between me and my colleagues, Bill Frederick, Bob Settlemeyer. Our starting point was sigmoid utility theory, which is an old theory in economics. First written down by Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate, and a very famous statistician, Leonard Savage. There's their pictures up there. I always like to have goofy pictures of academics because we're a goofy lot, but we're proud of it. And in this article, they came out and said that social class differences could influence risk-taking behavior. In the following way, if you're on the border of jumping into the next higher class, the satisfaction you get from doing that is much greater than any lack of satisfaction or any satisfaction you lose by losing your bid to get into the higher rank and just kind of still being the same schlep you are. And so that was their idea. The problem, they never operationalized this. They never laid it out in an explicit enough formulation that you could test it against data. So it's this background idea that from time to time has surfaced in different disciplines, anthropology, sociology, even biology. Biologists have looked at animal behavior in this way. But what we've done here at IPFW is we've made a concerted effort in giving life to this theory and then testing it to see just what its potential could be for explaining a whole variety of risk-taking behaviors. They can be from very peaceful things like becoming an entrepreneur or investing in a particularly risky portfolio to picking up arms. Anything that has some great potential risk to it could be modeled this way. And one of the alterations that we made to the theory was the focus on the fact that it's not so much the wealth per se that matters, but it's the social status that the wealth confers. And when we made that jump, that enabled us to look at these phenomenon and the entire array of human societies that anthropologists are aware of. Because when we think of wealth, we think of dollars, right? Money. But if you're a Highland New Guinea tribes person, wealth could be measured in pig tusks. Okay? There's all sorts of measures of wealth that matter to people in different cultures. Culture matters in that it helps people to define a particular dimension of wealth in their society. But ultimately, it's all wealth. And once we make that transition, we can use these general techniques to analyze how wealth is influencing behavior in many different contexts. And here's the crux of the theory. As you can see in the diagram here, person Y is like most of us in this room, painfully middle class and very risk averse. Most of us in this room, it's probably true that if we were offered a chance at bettering ourselves by some quantity, if we could go up in that quantity of wealth to a higher rank, more to the right of the graph here, we're going to go up by some amount D in our social status and in others' eyes. But if we lose, we get dumped down to that lower class. We're on the other sides of the tracks. Most of us don't take chances like that. Instead, we buy insurance, okay? But person X is the kind of person that interests us tonight. Person X is in a position where if that person wins, they go up B. They've entered the new status. They're somebody now. If they lose, well, there's still some poor person. Or, notice, it doesn't even have to deal with objective measures of poverty. This could be a relatively wealthy person who wants to become the super wealthy. They too would be motivated in the same way to take that chance to get into that whole new social standing. So this is what we started with. And I need to mention something briefly about how we actually measure risk. We use a measure that's been around for a long time in economics. We've actually used several in our research. But this one seems to work best, and for some very good reasons. It's the Arrow-Pratt measure. That's Kenneth Arrow, another Nobel laureate, and John Pratt, the people who came up with this about 40 years ago. And for those of you that are mathematically inclined, a utility function measures satisfaction with something like your wealth or social rank. And this is the risk sensitivity is measured by the negative of the second derivative divided by the first derivative. What essentially this is measuring is how convex upward, or how quickly that curve is swooping up for you. Are you on a really steep incline to greater social status, or are you kind of leveling out? Negative values of this measure imply risk proneness, a tendency to take these wild chances. Positive measures imply risk aversion, or the willingness to buy insurance and make sure that you don't fall back. Okay? And I like this analogy, and I'm indebted to Bill Frederick for it. It's like driving a car. Velocity is measured by the first derivative of a function. And when you're driving your car, you don't feel velocity. You could be going 65 miles an hour. You could be going 35 miles an hour. Especially if you had your eyes closed and you weren't looking at the trees go by, you'd have no idea how fast you were going. But you do feel it when you slam on the brakes or when you hit the gas. You feel acceleration. And that is what the second derivative of a function is measuring. And what we're saying here is that people have a sense of that social acceleration. And you hear this in popular rhetoric. How often have you heard someone say, well, I will be achieving my career goals very nicely in 10 years at this same rate, and I'm very pleased with myself. People don't talk that way, but you've heard someone say, you know, my career is taking off. That's when people are excited, right? My career is taking off. It's not just going up at some rate. It's swooping upward. Okay. I won't belabor the math, but I would love to come back to it if anyone wants to get into the mathematical details, because it actually has us very excited, because there's really some neat math behind all of this. And unfortunately, the bottom part of the slide is a bit cut off, but I think I can make it work. We've discovered something. When we look as anthropologists at wealth distributions, that is ranking from the poorest person to the wealthiest person in a society, and then measuring objectively what the wealth levels of those people are, we see this curve come up time after time after time again, regardless if this society is an ancient one or a modern one, if it's industrialized or it's tribal. We see the same pattern. This is really striking and was totally unexpected. The mathematical equation that you see up there is the utility equation that describes such a distribution of wealth. It's got a number of parameters that we can estimate that will give us the particular quantitative measure of exactly what shape a curve should have for a particular society. But the same equation is describing wealth distributions time after time again, no matter where we look at them. Let me give you some, and maybe one other thing I'll just point out here. just to reinforce the point. And the sections of the curve that are kind of swooping upward, you see here in what one of my colleagues from Northrop Grumman calls the knee of the curve there. And those very convex upward sections, that's where you expect those negative risk sensitivity values and for people to be taking big risks. In some contexts, that risk, once again, might be opening your own business. In other contexts, it might be joining with a bunch of others to try to overthrow your perceived oppressors. A couple examples here of where we see these things. Here's an ancient city, the ancient Mayan city of Tikal in modern-day Guatemala. That's the skyline of Tikal there. Some of you might recognize it from the first Star Wars movie. And there's the distribution of wealth. And we see the same thing time and time again. It's like two S's joined. One has got a very low, slow slope, and the other one swoops upward at a very fast rate. That rapidly rising part of the curve, that represents the elites, the movers and shakers in that society. The low part of the curve, well, that's the rest of us. Okay? And then down here, and unfortunately it's been cut off by the screen a little bit, we have the skyline of New York City and wealth distribution in the U.S., which follows, once again, a very similar kind of curve to the one we see for the ancient Mayans. Why would that be? Two very different economies, but we see the same distributions of wealth time and time again. Well, can we use these distributions of wealth to predict risk sensitivities and in turn predict violent behavior as a form of risk-taking? We've had a lot of success in doing this so far. One of the first examples we looked at was another ancient Mayan city, the ancient Mayan city of Copan, a place that I had the privilege of working at back in 1983. And the reason why we use this is researchers there compiled a measure of wealth for many of the hundreds of households that inhabited this city about 1,200 years ago. The measure of wealth was how much energy it took to build a person's house, which, by the way, is a very reliable measure of how wealthy someone is. People invest in their houses. Right? A lot of us invest in our houses. The Mayans did as well. And that was interesting. Once again, we see the low S at the bottom and then swooping up to a much faster S-shaped curve at the top when we get into that elite stratum of society. But the other thing about Copan is it's got beautifully preserved hieroglyphics. The longest Mayan text that still exists is the hieroglyphic staircase because the Spaniards couldn't burn it because it was stone. And it's still preserved there. And these things tell histories. All the buildings have hieroglyphics that say who built them, when, and in some cases for what purpose. Who dedicated this house will be preserved in these hieroglyphics. Incidentally, the ability to read these hieroglyphics extensively is only about, I say, around 15 years old. These are some very recent major breakthroughs. Well, reading the hieroglyphics has enabled archaeologists to piece together what happened to bring down the city-state of Copan in 822 AD. And our old theories were that these were mass rebellions. And why? Look at all those poor people down there. And what are the wealthy Mayans doing, the elite Mayans? They're having like big parties and orgies. They pull like spines through their genitalia for sacrificial reasons. And while they're doing that, all those poor peasants are out there toiling in the sun. Wouldn't that upset you? But evidently it didn't, because the peasants didn't rebel. There's no evidence of any sort of mass rebellion. But there's really good evidence that people in these couple of concave upward sections, the courtiers and the elite nobles, conspired to overthrow the king. The only buildings that were burnt were a couple administrative buildings and the king's palace. And then for the next 150 years, there was an oligarchy of elite nobles that ruled the city. So here what we have, you wouldn't even really call it a rebellion, you'd call it more a political coup that occurred. And we think that we've gotten insight by applying our model into why it was those particular people who, let's face it, were pretty well off, why they felt so aggrieved. They felt so aggrieved because the king had so much more than they did. And that's what gets under people's skin. Okay, world wealth data. We've looked at a lot of world wealth data supplied by the UN. And we've applied our model, including all of the quantitative methods of estimating these wealth distribution functions and risk sensitivities to ask, could the modern day wealth distribution on our planet, could that be fueling the kind of anti-Western resentment that we hear so much about? The answer is yes. But before we simply say, oh, well, there's a lot of poor people in the third world that are mad at us in the first world, we need to ask who's mad and why. Because not everyone is mad. Some people really love Western civilization, or at least the economic aspects of it. Can we use the methods that we're developing here at IPFW to zero in better on who really feels aggrieved versus who is actually kind of pleased with trying to emulate Western lifestyles? And we think we can. Here you see, obviously, the third world is that low first S-shaped curve. And then there's you can't really see the S here in this graph, but mathematically it comes out in the math that there's some interesting variation as you go up to the U.S. I might also point out that we're not the wealthiest people in the world. Can't you hear the resentment in my voice? It's the Luxembourgians. And they're way, way wealthier than we are. You know, so I'm starting to think Luxembourg next. China's interesting. And this is one that I'd love to come back to maybe if people want to discuss it more. China, remember this, China's 1/4 of the world. That's a significant fact, 1/4 of the world. And the bottom half of China has among it, by our predictions, some of the most risk-averse people in the world. But the top half of Chinese society, those entrepreneurs that are opening all these industries and businesses, are among the most risk-prone people in the world. We think that might be a significant fact. And then the other thing to consider, of course, we hear so much these days about jihadist recruiting, terrorism, etc. Where are those recruiting grounds? There's some other nations I should probably put on this graphic. Qatar, Oman, places like that. They're up around the UK and Israel. And they're actually some of the world's wealthiest nations. Kuwait is way up there. But the most fertile recruiting grounds have been places like Iran, Syria, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sudan. Notice that there's a huge difference in wealth between Pakistan and Sudan versus places like Indonesia. But they both happen to fall in those negative areas of risk proneness. And so once again, we think that our methods are helping us, albeit in a rather gross way because of the aggregation of the data here. But it's indicating that we can zero in better than perhaps people have before to predict those people who are most likely to be risk prone and potentially want to take up arms. Another analysis that we've done recently is on Palestinian society. Palestinian Authority, and then there's another non-for-profit statistical group that does research among Palestinians. They're very forthcoming with data on various social and sociological measures for Palestinians, including opinion surveys. It's fascinating and all easily accessible off the web. And what I looked at here was the distribution of wealth among wage earners in Palestinian society. And one thing that's very important to point out here is this is most properly an analysis of potential resentments and risk proneness of Palestinians to Palestinians. This is all within. It'd be great to have the data on how these various Palestinians stand with respect to larger Israeli society, but the Israelis are not as forthcoming with their social data. I imagine I can get it and will someday, but for now, we'll just look at this. And this is relevant because, of course, Yasser Arafat has recently died. There's been an election. There's a lot of political activity and a lot of concern over Palestine. All right, are they going to hold it together or could it break apart? And if it could break apart, what would those flashpoints be? And might we be able to use this kind of analysis to identify them? Well, if we look at it here, I have a few more things that will flash up on the screen. Who is the most discontent? And what we find is that it's primarily low-income people, kind of itinerant repair people that you would see in the street, people that do low-level kind of services, the masses, if you will. They're pretty discontent, according to our measures. But also people in publishing. I would say that's a real recipe for some social unrest. The masses are upset, and the articulate people who have control of media are upset. Okay? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these people are going to turn to arms. It could, in some circumstances, mean that they might turn to risky investments or something of that nature. But arms is always one of those options that's on the table. And so these are the places within Palestinian society that you might see unrest, Palestinian to Palestinian. We also think this would feed into Palestinian discontentment with their larger situation in the Middle East. Because once again, if you feel you're getting a raw deal, you know, the point is people are going to seek ways to lash out. It might not always be at, those that are necessarily above them in their own social hierarchy. Sometimes they'll look outside. And of course, Israelis are doing better financially than Palestinians. So there's a lot of potential for unrest there, as I think is obvious when we look at the news. Is anyone content? The skilled laborers seem to be pretty okay. Be interesting to back this up with more sociological surveys then of these different occupations to see if we can get further confirmation of what we're predicting here. And then the other thing to notice here is note the pervasiveness of discontent. The overall average is negative. You've got a discontented population. Incidentally, that's true of the world population as well. Overall, people are pretty risk-prone. That means some people are hungry and they're going to want to invest, take chances, maybe engage in Western economic practices. In other cases, they're going to take up arms, and there's tremendous potential for that in today's world. The final example that I want to go over here is Darfur. And I kind of promised it in the abstract. It turned out to be really challenging to do because, of course, this is a very complicated situation. And of course, it's very, very hard to get data that you could sink your teeth into. But we actually found some. Now, of course, I think you're familiar with the ongoing crisis in Western Sudan, the Darfur region. The Fur are one of the main ethnic groups in that area. They tend to be agriculturalists. Dar, it means land of, so it's the land of the Fur. But they're not the only people living there, and you've probably all heard about a lot of racially motivated, religiously motivated violence of these Janjaweed Arab militias who are attacking the Fur and other people and doing all kinds of horrible things. One of the things that's frustrated me in a lot of the coverage is always you hear about it's racism, it's religious intolerance, it's this and it's that. And one of the pieces of evidence that has been used, I've heard on NPR in places, is that 1/3 of victims of this violence have had racial epithets thrown at them while they were being killed and stuff. The thing that really strikes me about that is 2/3 of people have seen someone else killed. Okay? Almost 80%, over 80% of people have had all of their goods stolen. The thing that's really happening here is competition over wealth. That's what's really happening. It's striking to me that because talk is cheap, it's easy to hurl a racial slur. It's a lot harder to pack up someone's possessions and cart them off. It's amazing to me that it's not 100% racial epithets and a minority of other things. I think this is tipping us off that, once again, wealth matters. You know, people are not hurling racial and religious slurs and whatnot. Yeah, they're doing it, but it's kind of an afterthought after they've killed half your family and carted your stuff away. Once again, I think it's easy to get distracted because we're all kind of in love with culture. We love our own culture, and culture is really big these days. And as an anthropologist, I'm glad it is. I'm glad it's in people's consciousness. But we've got to be careful. It's not the panacea that's going to explain everything. There's some other things that underlie culture, namely wealth, that I think still matter more. This one quote, which was gathered by U.S. State Department personnel who are working in the region trying to document what was going on. This is a quote from a Janjaweed militiaman, and these are obviously pictures of the Janjaweed are horse-mounted, armed herders. I spent a good part of my life studying these sorts of people, as Alan was pointing out earlier, and so not in Sudan, but in other places, obviously. And so that's what you see depicted there. These are the culprits, if you will. But this quote, I think, really brings to focus what's going on. The quote is, "Slaves run. Leave the country. You do not belong. Why are you not leaving this area for the Arab cattle to graze?" They're not saying, "Get out of here, you Christians," or "Get out of here, you so-and-sos." They're saying, Get out of here. Our cattle need the land to graze. And that is the root of this conflict, with no doubt. I don't have any units on my axes here because I've actually looked at several different measures of wealth, comparing the Darfur region to the central region around Khartoum in Sudan, which is the wealthiest area. And generally, people are about 3 to 5 times wealthier in Khartoum. That's tremendous potential for this kind of resentment to begin to grow. And there always was resentment in Darfur. For instance, back in '96, there was a survey, and by African standards, 94% of the people in Darfur lived in poverty, whereas only 20% lived in poverty in Khartoum. So, I mean, we're talking about a place where virtually every single person you meet is very poor. And this led to different forms of risk-prone activity. The Janjaweed did what pastoralists have always done. They smuggled stuff. Okay, pastoralists are mobile. They've got herds that move around. And so those are the people that are smuggling the TV sets across the borders and things like that. And as a matter of fact, Janjaweed, technically it means man with a gun on a horse. But for a long time, it was a term used for kind of the lawless folks out there in the savannas grazing their animals. And so there always was some level of unrest in this area. For the Four, they too were feeling this resentment toward the central government in Khartoum, and that surfaced in rebellious activity. There were a couple of rebellions that were being organized in this part of Sudan. And then in the 80s and 90s, a series of severe droughts racked the region, creating the following situation, which is really kind of sparked all of the intense violence that we're seeing today. The droughts caused 2 problems for the Janjaweed. First of all, they lost many of their animals in the droughts, making them, in absolute terms, poor as well as relative terms. And so they started stealing other people's livestock and raiding. That also forced them to change their pattern of movement, and they started moving into the agricultural areas of Darfur sooner than they normally did, and their animals started trampling people's crops before the peasants could bring them in. So that created more unrest as well. So we've got some fighting going on between Janjaweed and various other groups like the Four in this area of Sudan. What this created then was a situation where some of the Four become very risk averse. They start being victimized, and they don't have anything else to turn to. But other Four took this as an opportunity. Those who were probably a bit better off and more inclined to try to organize some rebellion against Khartoum to really take the initiative. And so at this time, they declare an independence movement. They fight some battles with the Sudanese military, and things start to get really bloody. At that point, Khartoum arms the Janjaweed, and then, of course, aids and abets them, as I think we well know now, by bombing villages and everything. And the whole thing spirals into the incredible cycle of violence that we're witnessing today in Darfur. And so now, Khartoum, which is very pro-Islamic and whatnot, is using the fact that a lot of these Janjaweed are Arab and Muslim to try to use that as an angle. But many of their victims have been Muslims as well. So see, once again, religion is not the key here. Likewise, the politics is entering and whatnot, but it's all entering after the fact. Had there not been that sequence of devastating droughts, Darfur would have never reached the tipping point that would have allowed people to try to apply these other factors and make them and use them to fuel the conflict. Once again, wealth matters. If we ignore that, we're not going to be able to explain anything, and I'm afraid that we might delude ourselves into coming up with really false explanations of much of the strife that we're concerned with today. And so to conclude, the anthropologist would like to say that wealth still matters. Obviously, wealth matters for absolute reasons. The more wealth you are, the more wealth you have, the better off you're going to be, more access to health care, things of that nature, which is a very salient thing for most people in the world. But also, it's a key indicator of social status. Okay? It not only gives you stuff, it also makes you a worthy being in other people's eyes. You can all think of exceptions, but that's kind of the point. They tend to be exceptions. Okay, in any culture, once we anthropologically identify what the currency is that people focus on as wealth, that currency always correlates with social status. We have a whole theory in anthropology called cultural success theory that revolves around this. And of course, the key is not only that it's an indicator of social status, but it's an indicator of relative social status. So you can be destitutely poor and be very disgruntled and very risk-prone. You can be pretty wealthy, but if your next social neighbor, if you will, the next person up the ranking from you is way wealthier, you will go around whining just as much as the destitutely poor person. And I think this is very much the source of a lot of organizers of rebellions, as well as get-rich-quick schemes and whatnot. Now, what should we do about this? What could one do about this? Well, I'll tell you right now, I'm an anthropologist. Policy's not my thing. But that's the obvious question, I think, on a lot of people's minds. Is there anything, could we use any of our knowledge perhaps to aid in third world development in ways that might ameliorate the strife that we see in our world today? And I think we can. There's not enough money to just help everyone. And there's other problems with doing that in a wholesale fashion. There's so many failed economic development programs one can point toward, despite how well-intentioned they are. It's really kind of tricky to do that. But one problem is we need to know how to focus that aid. If one's goal is to ameliorate strife, then one needs to really target people in those convex sections of those wealth distributions. That's who you've got to get to. Furthermore, if you want to ameliorate strife, you may even have to be able to entice people that already seem relatively well off, provided that they're in one of those positions that indicates they should actually be very risk-prone. So that's one thing that I think our research might eventually someday be able to contribute to. And another thing, I'd like to end here on a rather depressing note, just because my colleague in political science, Jim Lutz, ended on the same depressing note in his book on terrorism. Wealth differences I have found in every single society for which I've been able to get data. It's now dozens and dozens and growing. Even hunter-gatherer societies that we often say are egalitarian aren't by any stretch of the imagination. Wealth differences are pervasive. Doesn't mean we have to necessarily accept that or be happy about it, but it's a fact of life. Given that that is a fact of life, the kind of strife, the need for having knowledge like this, unfortunately, I guess, is just not going to go away. Just like my colleague Jim Lutz pointed out at the end of his book, for as long as we've got records, there's been terrorism. That's probably not going away either. So, on that depressing note, I think I'd like to thank you all very much for coming here and listening to me tonight.
Questions? Comments?
Yes. I'm sorry, you're moderating.
Well, it suggests, your last conclusion suggests that helping poor people is actually a bad thing, because really poor people don't have the resources to indulge in the rebellion. And if they're discontented and you help them, all you're doing is providing the second half of the two-step equation.
In some cases, that would be the case. In other cases, if there's those poor people on that convex upwards section, then you might want to apply some aid. Although I think, as you've just pointed out, you help them, and I've got some other people that are upset. To the extent that we can do anything economically to ameliorate these crises, I think we need to accept the fact that it's going to be hitting a moving target. You're going to put out one fire, another one's going to get created, and you just have to accept the fact that, you know, you're going to be moving people around. It'd be a very long time before all the fires are out. In my youth, I used to participate in fire squads to put out forest fires, and it's just one after another. But I guess the hopeful thing is we never did leave the whole forest burned down. So, but you're absolutely right. And that's a harsh reality I think we need to face in these matters. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you say the West has a feeling of being oppressed, especially possibly the elite, which was at the top of your curve. What I'm wondering is, do these people have a feeling of enough is enough, or how much is enough? You know, and if they want and strive more, is that the cause for their oppression, or do they, at that point in time, take that calculated risk to go even higher? How much is it? Cassius Clay once said, you know, they always want more. Well, how much is enough?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I was just wondering the psychology of how much is enough. Do they give back to society like a lot of philanthropists, you know, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and that type of thing, or do they just keep on going onward and upward to the point where so they don't have to feel the oppression or the depression?
Yes, very good question. As people get wealthier and wealthier, they do give more and more. You get cases like the Carnegies. But in some cases, that's a genuine feeling of wanting to give back to society that's sustained them. In other cases, it's a good way of gaining more status among your peers. And we're all familiar with these competitions that will go on for giving even. So that's kind of part of my cynical answer to your very good question. And of course, we can always find individuals who finally say, you know, enough is enough. I'm going to be content with this. But the real question here is when we look at the whole span of humanity, both around the world today and, of course, throughout history, what has been the trend? And the trend has been one to be thoroughly acquisitive and always wanting more. And I think that is fueling the ever kind of spiraling, risk proneness and whatnot that we see.
Jim in the back.
Mm-hmm.
If I understand your model, what you're saying is that you get in trouble where you've got a group where the odds, what they will gain if they are successful outweighs what they will lose if they are unsuccessful. Mm-hmm. And then they're the ones who take the risks.
Yes.
If that is the case, then you've also said that 90% rebellions and stuff like that don't work, and people get killed with or leading them. My question is, are people stupid?
No, they're not, but they're rolling the dice. That's the whole point. This is taking a risk. You know the old saying, no guts, no glory. And that's what's fueling them, yeah. We're also cautious in just how far we're going to explain. Of course, there's days when we think we've explained everything. We've got the theory of everything for social science. But then we usually come down and we realize that there will be exceptions and whatnot and restrictions to how far we can push this. Like I wonder sometimes about like the suicide bomber research. We're trying to get the data right now on those individuals from the researchers that did it to see if we can take, for instance, data like this from Palestine and see if there's any correlations there. And that would be a good and important test. Boy, you know, there's days I have doubts that you're going to be able to predict a suicide bomber. But then again, we recently did an analysis, just, what was it, last Thursday, Bill? Of social status among the 62 co-conspirators of 9/11. And we came up with another one of these freaky S-shaped curves. And we were able to predict 17 of the 19 people who took the ultimate risk in getting on the airplane. So let me say, come back for more later. We're not sure how far we'll be able to push this theory. There's days we think we can.
The model that you're proposing basically is arguing that it's almost a relative deprivation situation.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is, what seems to be missing from your analysis is that there are relationships between these positions. Certainly the whole history of the labor movement and rebellions during the labor movement was at times stimulated by action on the part of owners. And so it's not that they're just independent positions. One sort of trying to reach another level is that maybe the actions of those at the top may actually be stimulating the rebellious activity because of changes in their position as a result of those actions. So, I mean, that doesn't seem to be in your model at all. I mean, there's no interaction between positions. It's merely a sense of when it reaches a point of being feeling relatively deprived, then they rebel. Isn't there an issue of relationships between these positions that could stimulate rebellion?
Two answers to your question. First of all, what we're finding is that this analysis is explaining and predicting a lot. So we think that simple aspirations, as I've described here tonight, is very important. So important that it might even be more important than what you're suggesting. The second answer to your question is, what I've presented tonight is the mathematical modeling aspect of the research that we've been doing between anthropology, computer science, and math. There's a computer science, a simulation side to this research. Because it's one thing to have a mathematical equation that explains stuff, but the downside is everything gets smoothed out. And what's really happening in real people's lives are discrete interactions among agents, among actors. And so we've turned to computer simulations to simulate interactions among those agents to see if we reproduce the same results as we have in these math models. And we've just begun that research, and it's actually really taking off in the last week. And those simulations would allow us to pose questions of the sort that you've just posed yourself. Okay? You can't pose that in the context of a mathematical formula. You can. It gets really messy and the math becomes intractable. But you can pose it in the context of a realistic computer simulation, and we're developing those sorts of things. And of course, there's always, which side you want to look at it. Is it the actions of the owners that provoke the workers, or is it actions of the workers that are provoking the owners? I think sometimes there's issues there as well. And I just like to reinforce, aspirations seem to have a lot to do with it. There really is something to relative deprivation theory. I know it's never been operationalized this way, and we think we've come up with a better operationalization, a better way of enacting it and testing it on data, and it seems to be working well for us.
This gentleman right here.
Yes.
Larry, if you just look at the U.S. as a model, what does it tell you about where the risk takers are, and where are we fairly
as a population, remember, we are a really big nation. 280 million people is a lot. The vast majority of those people are painfully risk adverse. We actually have a rather unusual curve in that it doesn't start out with risk-prone people. There are some who are very, very poor in our nation, but they actually are a very, very small proportion of the population when you consider the 280 million that we are. And that's actually what led me to the world data. I said, where's that concave upward part of the curve? Well, it's called the rest of the world. That's where that concavity starts. And so that's part of it. Most people are very risk averse in U.S. society. Who are the most risk-prone people? We did a study of this. And now there's not blood in our streets, I know, in terms of any kind of popular rebellion. But there is one risk-prone behavior that a lot of us take for granted. It's called voting. And it's by definition risk-prone because, I probably shouldn't say this, but your little vote out of those other millions isn't really going to do that much for you. All right? The gas money it costs for you to go to vote doesn't come back to you in terms of an expected value for what you get out of casting the vote. Who votes way more than they ought to be? Upper middle class people. Those are the people that you hear from the most politically. And those are people that get really engaged in the political process, do things like make sure they get out there to vote, et cetera, et cetera. So there are risk-prone people, but they tend to be that kind of, sometimes referred to as creative class, entrepreneurial class. They seem to be the most activated people in our society. I mean, if it was the other way around, and it was really the workers, the laborers, we'd still have a vibrant union movement in our society, but it keeps just kind of whittling away more and more. When you look at the overall structure of wealth in our society, you begin to see why that's taking place.
One more question, please. Jamie.
If I understood you correctly, I think you said at one point that most people in the world are risk-prone today.
Yeah.
Sort of just at a global level. And I have two brief questions. One, do you have any idea whether that's changed over time? And number two, what do you think explains it? Is it some global distribution of wealth, or is it sort of the accumulation of country-by-country distributions of wealth in which people are comparing themselves to their own compatriots rather than sort of as whole societies to other whole societies?
Yeah, excellent. A couple of questions. Let's see, the very first one was...
Has it changed over time?
Has it changed over time? Yes, it has. We've got data from 1988, data from 1999. It hasn't changed in any dramatic way. Pretty much all countries are in the same places. The curves get curvy at the same places. But there are some differences. And we're actually, today Bill Frederick and I were talking about maybe going to New York and sitting down with the keeper of the records at the UN, whoever that person is, and all the data, because they do these statistics every couple of years, and getting a real longitudinal study. That would be a very good thing. Actually, that would be a great thing for someone, I would say, like a history, poli-science professor to do, Janie. And then in terms of what's motivating this, I think media has provided a means for people to get information about wealth distributions that is unprecedented. 100 years ago, people in a lot of parts of the world would have had maybe a vague notion that things were a bit better here, but they would have never had the information that they do, as distorted as it gets from media. But, someone in, Kazakhstan, all they have to do is catch one episode of Friends or Will and Grace, and whether that's a realistic portrayal of our wealth differences or not, it can make them pretty ticked off. And so that's one element to the answer. The other element to your answer that I would like to throw out there is I was looking at how people are comparing themselves to the rest of the world. That's where media comes in. But as they say, all politics are local, although I think less so as time goes on. And another very important dimension is that local level, so within society. There's a great study of academics and turnover rates that was done looking at all 818 institutions in the U.S. And there are two dimensions that mattered to people that got them really upset, that caused them to quit their job and go elsewhere. One was how they were doing within their institution. And now we've got chairs and deans who are now facing this time of year when the increments are given out and people are grumbling. And someone is really ticked off because someone down the hall got paid more. That local level is important. But also to understand and predict turnover rates in academic institutions, they also had to know about the global view, which was how a political scientist compares with another political scientist in the discipline. You combine the two things, and you got some really good predictions. And I think the same sort of kind of cross-cutting analysis would be useful here.
Thank you, Larry. And
thank you.
For coming.
Oh my goodness! There it is.
I need to do two things. First, I have here the Traditional Arts and Sciences Certificate of Appreciation to give to Larry for delivering the lecture.
Thank you.
And I want to invite all of you for punch and light refreshments right out at the back of the room. And again, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Mark.